All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 33, Section 3, Global Culture. So, global culture is pretty much beliefs, attitudes, ideas, and increasingly, especially after the year 2000 and after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has kind of led the world in producing culture, dating all the way back to the 1930s with Hollywood films, but also dating back to the 1920s with various music genres like jazz, which you could listen to over the radio, and really progressing from that era. Some people have described American culture's impact on the world as cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is essentially when one culture takes over. This has been especially more prevalent lately due to technological advancements. Radios and televisions, radios being available in the 1920s, televisions in the 1950s, were only available to industrialized countries by the 1980s and 1990s because of improvements in technology. Radios and televisions were becoming increasingly available around the world. Add on top satellite starting with the 1990s meant that both radio and television could pretty much be accessed anywhere around the world. Technology was a main, we'll say, main spreader of culture, and most of that being produced in the United States. Additionally, the invention of CNN, or cable news network, that is the 24-hour newscast, has made, in some cases, news almost a form of entertainment. This really creates a need to quote-unquote make the news. So when events happen, they're happening almost immediately. The fall of the Soviet Union was broadcast live on TV. The protests in Tiananmen Square. Things like the 2003 Iraq War were broadcast really as they were happening, and this has created certainly a global awareness of things going on around the world, depending on what is being broadcast on 24-hour news. All this has been made even more quicker with the invention of the internet, otherwise known as the World Wide Web. The internet not only has made news more available to us, but has also revolutionized the way that shopping is done. E-commerce, or shopping online. In addition to social media, things like Facebook and Twitter have really altered the way that human beings interact with one another. Social media in some cases is still, we're still sort of understanding or trying to understand the exact impact that social media has had. This was made even more prevalent with the invention of, cell phones existed as a telephone before, but really what is meant by this is smartphones that have access to the internet. And now, we're connected to the World Wide Web and to each other and to news stories and to social media in really radical ways. One thing that may have been true initially was that, early on, the United States held somewhat of a monopoly when it came to global culture, but increasingly that is becoming less and less the case. The spread of culture has transitioned from primarily coming from the United States to more of a global phenomenon. You might think of things like Bollywood, India's Hollywood or film industry. Things like K-pop, Korean pop music, as opposed to American pop music, are just some examples of how cultural interaction is not necessarily, or global culture is not necessarily, a story of cultural imperialism, but rather sort of a marketplace of cultures and that being exchanged. On the one hand, there is also a growing global elite culture. This has a lot to do with education The highly educated of cultures and people around the world have a lot more to do with each other, or a lot more in common with each other than perhaps they do even with their own countrymen, or countrymen and countrywomen. This is true of the English language, which in some cases is sort of like a global language. English second language, or ESL as they call it, stands for English second language, is taught in pretty much almost, it's taught in most countries around the world. And that's because in order to gain an advantage in terms of like business and dealing internationally, English has become the predominant language of that idea. There is one thing to consider when it comes to the rise of global culture, that is more people speaking the same language, watching the same television shows, or reading the same news stories, and that is whether or not cultural diversity suffers. In some ways, this is true. So, for example, there are less languages spoken today than they were in the past. Some have criticized this as Americanization. That is American food, music, and fashion. So we might say American music, food, and fashion replacing traditional / local culture. Again, it's kind of the same thing as cultural imperialism. And while there is a certain degree of truth to that, probably the more accurate way to portray it is that it's been more of a blending of cultures. So for example, take something like McDonald's. A McDonald's in Japan, a McDonald's in the United States, a McDonald's in Russia, they're all the same company, but they might serve different food products depending on what the local tastes and local traditions are.